30th of August is celebrated each year as the International Day of the world's indigenous populations. And it commemorates the start of the first working group on indigenous peoples, which was convened at the UN in 1982. So my name is Dalmi Cupido. I run the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Program at OCISA. One of the most critical issues faced by indigenous communities in Southern Africa and in Africa more broadly is one of recognition. Communities that have faced a particular history of dispossession and oppression, genocide, slavery, land dispossession. Their languages are by and large not recognized. The only country in Southern Africa which very recently recognized what they call Khoisan languages is Zimbabwe, oddly enough. In South Africa, none of the 11 official languages are languages spoken by San communities. In Namibia, likewise. In most of our countries, South Africa, Botswana, Zambia, Zimbabwe, our governments don't even want to really use the term indigenous. The two primary documents which speak to indigenous people's rights are the International Labour Organization Treaty 169 and possibly even more importantly than that, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People of 2007. Indigenous peoples have campaigned and ultimately succeeded in ensuring the adoption of this declaration was because they'd observed and experienced the fact that human rights as traditionally understood as contained in the UN Charter, that they were necessary but not sufficient, and that they really didn't deal with some of the specific issues that indigenous peoples have. Some of these issues as a result of a history of dispossession, a history of genocide, slavery, which all of them have in common, but also a current history of marginalization, of entrenched racial discrimination at the hands of dominant groups, the descendants of European settlers, or in some cases, particularly in Southern Africa and Africa more broadly, of dominant ethnic groups which they either live next to or have been in various ways subjugated by over the course of the last few hundred years. And so indigenous people's rights speak to issues of their relationship with the land, their issues of solidarity with each other, respect for their sovereign cultural and political institutions. And many of those types of human rights are not, in most cases, recognized in a kind of mainstream human rights discourse. So indigenous people's rights, in that sense, what they really ask of us is not that indigenous peoples should be granted more rights than anyone else. We have to recognize the specific current and historical human rights abuses that indigenous peoples have undergone and which they face, and that governments need to take special measures to ensure that the dignity and in fact the continued existence of these communities as communities is made possible. In Southern Africa there are between 100 and 120,000 San people spread across 6 countries. The vast majority live in Namibia and Botswana, but there are also indigenous communities in Zambia, in Zimbabwe, in Angola, and of course in South Africa. In most of these countries, they form a very small minority of the population. In terms of access to education, in terms of access to healthcare, in terms of sort of all the human development indicators, you'll find that indigenous communities, the San in particular, fall really at the bottom of the rung. 80% of San communities live more than 80 kilometers away from the nearest health facility. For communities where they really have no resources. Their language is either dying or, in some cases, sadly have died out. In South Africa, for example, just in the last 20 years, we've seen the deaths of the last 20 or so speakers of the ancient Nui language. Zimbabwe, the trial language is dying out. There are thought to be somewhere less than 40 speakers of that language left. So these are problems that are really unique to indigenous communities as opposed to, say, in our context, other African communities. So it's not just questions of poverty. It's not just questions of, their human rights being abused in the kind of classical sense. They're really specific and particular problems that they face as a result of this type of marginalization at the hands of dominant communities. Through our programming, we support land claims by indigenous peoples to their ancestral territories, land rights against encroachment, either by the state or by extractives, or even just by, commercial farmers in some cases, who want to take over indigenous people's lands. Cultural and linguistic rights, programming around the economic rights and livelihoods rights of indigenous peoples. So we support initiatives around promoting education and educational attainment for indigenous kids. And we also, in response to, I think, what is a critical concern for indigenous peoples, which is around the effects of climate change, what that is doing to the environment, and what that is doing not only to their environment, but their ability to make a livelihood on the lands which they are able to occupy. So we support natural resource governance initiatives that empower indigenous peoples and that recognize their particular role as stewards of their territories.